That divine and all-beautiful world, then, which, from the supreme arch of the heavens to the extremity of the earth, is contained by the immutable providence of the Deity, existed from eternity without any generation, and will be eternal through all the following periods of time, nor is it guarded by any other substance than by the proximate investiture of the fifth body, the summit of which is the solar ray, situated, as it were, in the second degree from the intelligible world, but it is more anciently comprehended by the King and Moderator of all things, about whom the universe subsists. This cause, therefore, whether it is lawful to call him that which is superior to intellect, or the idea of the things which are, but whom I should call the intelligible whole, or the One, since the One appears to be the most ancient of all things, or that which Plato is accustomed to denominate the Good. This uniform cause, then, of the universe, who is to all beings the administrator of beauty, perfection, union, and immeasurable power, according to a primary nature abiding in himself, produced from himself, as a medium between the middle intellectual and demiurgic causes, that mighty divinity, the Son, perfectly similar to himself. And this was the opinion of the divine Plato, when he says, "This is what I called the Son of the Good, which the Good generated analogous to itself, that as this in the intelligible place is to intellect and the objects of intelligence, so is that in the visible place to sight and the objects of sight. Hence it appears to me that light has the same proportion to that which is visible as truth to that which is intelligible. But this intelligible universe, as it is the progeny of the idea of the first and greatest good, eternally abiding about his stable essence, obtains the supremacy among the intellectual gods, and is the source of the same perfection to these as the good to the intelligible gods. But according to my opinion, good is to intelligibles the cause of beauty, essence, perfection, and union, comprehending and illuminating their nature by its boniform power. The Son, therefore, distributes the same excellences to the intellectual gods, of whom he has appointed the sovereign ruler by the ordination of the good. At the same time, it must be observed that these gods are coexistent with his intellectual Son, by means of which, as it appears to me, from exerting a boniform cause among the intellectual gods, he administers all things according to the invariable rectitude of intellect. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Schola Hermetica. What you just heard is a reading from one of the opening passages of the Emperor Julian's Hymn to King Helios, also sometimes translated as Hymn to the Sovereign Son. Today we'll be discussing the Emperor Julian's fascinating system of pagan theology. For those unfamiliar with him, the Emperor Julian the Philosopher, though perhaps better known by the moniker bestowed on him by his Christian rivals, Julian the Apostate, was the last pagan emperor of the Roman Empire, and the last emperor of the Constantinian dynasty. Julian was the nephew of the first Christian emperor Constantine the Great, through his half-brother Julius Constantius. Though raised a Christian, Julian rejected Christianity in his youth for Neoplatonic paganism, and upon becoming emperor, set about restoring paganism as the state religion of the Roman Empire, and if not for his short reign of 18 months, brought about by his untimely death in battle against the Sasanian Persian Empire, he would have no doubt succeeded. His reign from 361 to 363 CE, though easily bypassed by Christian historians, nonetheless had a profound impact on late Roman and subsequent Christian history. To quote the author Anthony Kaldellis on Julian's coming to power from his book The New Roman Empire, A History of Byzantium, he was an open-hearted and unafraid man. Julian had friends and trusted supporters to whom he could confidently delegate power. He was popular in the West and had no rivals in the East. He was the most educated man to reach the Roman throne in centuries, and also had the most impressive imperial pedigree to date, being the great-great-grandson of an emperor, great-grandson of another, nephew of a third, cousin to 3 Augusti, 2 Caesars, and a king, and half-brother to a Caesar. Normally in history this is a recipe for mediocrity, but now, Julian believed that almost all his imperial kin were bad, and set out to govern differently. Moreover, his reign had momentous consequences for Orthodox identity, as his career and the hysterical reactions to it served later as a permanent reminder of the tension between Orthodoxy and Hellenism. In fact, later Romans used him to define and police the boundaries of Orthodoxy. Down to 1453 and beyond, they continued to accuse each other of being new Julians. Therefore, Julian's reign was not, as Athanasius predicted, a small cloud that will soon pass. It became an obsession that lingered and still does. Julian sought to create a single overarching theology that would synthesize all the major pagan cults of the empire with Neoplatonism and impart this as a new kind of state church to the Roman Empire in place of the fractious, hypocritical, and infighting Christianity that he was raised with and that he saw actively trying to strip down and overthrow traditional Greco-Roman society and all its achievements. In this video, I will expound on just what Julian's theology was and how the gods were to be understood, and what our relationship to the divine entails. For this, I have drawn from Julian's 2 surviving pagan hymns, or perhaps dissertations would be a more accurate translation, that expound his theology from the standpoint of 2 of the most popular pagan mystery religions of his time, the cult of Mithras, Sol Invictus, and the cult of the Great Mother. These are his hymn to King Helios and hymn to the Mother of the Gods, respectively. I have also drawn from the work by Julian's close friend and mentor Sallust the Neoplatonist, who wrote a work in dedication to Julian and for his use in his religious reform known as On the Gods and the World. Now, before we get into Julian's exact theology, we will need to take a brief look at the Neoplatonist philosophy from which he was drawing. Julian's Neoplatonism was strongly derived from the works of the Syrian mystic Iamblichus, who lived 1 generation prior to Julian himself, though at the time Iamblichus's philosophy was criticized by other Platonists for its strong use of theurgy, magic, and from the standpoint of some, supernaturalism. His philosophy, nonetheless, became very popular and eventually became the basis of later Neoplatonic thought. In this way, Neoplatonism was able to develop towards becoming something of a religion in itself. Neoplatonic cosmology posits that at the root of all things is a single divine monad, also known as the One or the Good, and this is the ultimate essence of all realities. There is then an outpouring of this singular essence which culminates in 3 spheres, each depending on the last. The highest sphere is the noetic or intelligible world. It is intelligible because it is both the seat of the divine mind or nous, and it can only be known through intellection. No physical sense can perceive the existence of the intelligible realm. The powers here are self-contained and exist as divine forms or ideas of the divine mind. From the intelligible sphere is produced the noeric or intellectual sphere. It is intellectual because it is in this sphere that entities, gods and souls, come into being who possess the intellectual ability to perceive their own origins as rooted in the powers of the intelligible sphere above them. Succeeding this one is the aesthetic or sensible sphere. It is sensible because this is the realm of physical bodies who must perceive things not through mental intellection, but through physical sensation. It is this last that is the created, generative, or material realm wherein our mortal existence occurs. This is a very simplistic rendering of the Platonic scheme. However, it is enough for us to begin to grasp Julian's theology. Though it is typical to portray these spheres as descending as a chain, it would probably be more accurate to say that they are overlayered upon one another, with the intelligible containing the intellectual and the intellectual containing the sensible. Essentially, these are different states of energy, moving at different vibrations, for each higher thing reflects itself into the sphere below it, and each form of the lower sphere is derived from its archetype on high. Julian's goal was to unite this scheme to the popular religions of his time. He is not constructing this from nothing, but replicating the knowledge of the mysteries into a singular theology. He was certainly not the only one to do this in his time, but he is wonderfully succinct in his endeavor. We must turn now to look at the major pagan religious cults of his time. The classical myths of the Olympians were well known to all and form the basis of all theological knowledge. But with the conquests of the Roman Empire came the gifts of that conquest, part of which was the absorption of the various cults and deities of the conquered nations, which allowed for large-scale adaptations and synthesis of the various religious traditions, with particular emphasis on the similarities found between these religions. Besides Christianity, the foremost popular religions of the late Roman era were firstly the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, which was dedicated to the worship of an almighty, all-encompassing solar divinity. The roots of this worship were many and varied, and to spare time I will dedicate another video to this topic, which is quite fascinating in itself, but should be understood as producing the greatest rival to Christianity as the potential state religion of the Roman Empire. Second to this, and it was really a sort of esoteric extension of the cult of Sol Invictus at this point, was the cult of Mithras. Mithras was originally an Indo-Iranian deity, popular amongst the Persian and other Iranian groups, but who had also gradually been adopted by various other peoples of the former Persian Empire, including the Armenians and the Cilicians, the latter of whom the Romans were said to have picked up the cult of Mithras. All evidence shows that this was an especially astrological religion, and this can be discerned in Julian's hymn to King Helios as well. Third was the cult of the Great Mother, an Asiatic cult in origin that the Romans had picked up from Asia Minor during their war with the Carthaginians. Locally, amongst the Phrygians, she was known as Cybele, and equated by the Greeks with the Titan mother Rhea. The Romans, however, called her Magna Mater, the Great Mother, or the Mother of the Gods. Her religion was considered extremely exotic to the Romans, as the priests, in imitation of their Lord and Savior Attis, the partner of the Great Mother, castrated themselves and lived a bisexed life, which we might consider transgender today. Finally, there was the similar in theme but different in origin cult of Isis out of Egypt. Isis had become extremely popular even as far back as the period of the classical Greeks, where her worship had been adopted in parts of Greece itself and was spread far and wide by the Romans. Along with Isis was brought the worship of her husband Serapis, a late form of Osiris, who was seen as an all-encompassing father deity, and other members of the Egyptian pantheon, Horus, Anubis, and Tot Hermes. Isis was seen as the ultimate savioress and the queen of heaven. Julian's two surviving hymns seek to incorporate both the cult of Sol Invictus, or Mithras, and the cult of the Great Mother into a Neoplatonic framework. But as I said, Julian was not inventing this all-embracing kind of theological speculation. The Hermetica itself carries many of the same theological themes, but from a specifically Greco-Egyptian position. Because of this, it may be helpful for viewers to watch my video wherein I read out the Pymander, as I will be making comparison between that text and Julian's theological scheme at other points in this video. I will place the link in the description below. Now to begin, in Julian's cosmogony, the sun is portrayed as a triple being. Not that he states it exactly as such, but there is a different aspect or mode or expression of the solar deity for each of the three worlds. However, they are one in essence, with each one simply being an outpouring or emanation of the previous one's power as it seeks to establish each subsequent world. At the highest level, born from pure intellect, is Zeus Helios. To Julian, Father Zeus and Helios are one and the same deity. He offers various proofs to this effect, such as that this is known to be the custom in Cyprus, and we could add in ancient Crete as well, and that Hesiod states that Helios is the child of Hyperion and Thea. However, Julian takes these as euphemisms. Hyperion means the one who is above all things, or the Most High. This would indicate that Hyperion refers to the One, the Good. And as Helios is himself identical with this good, and is self-generated, this means that Helios is begotten of his own highest nature in the good. As for Thea, this name merely means that which is divine, and refers to the same. Thus Helios should be understood as his own mother and father. Iamblichus, quoting a work by Macrobius, states, Zeus, Hades, Helios, Serapis, three gods in one godhead. Serapis and Helios are here understood as referring to one entity, but they are also identified as identical with Zeus, the creator, and Hades, the keeper of souls, whom Julian describes as not frightening as portrayed in the myths, but rather mild and gentle, as he completely frees our souls from generation and lifts them up to the intelligible world. This figure of Zeus Helios as demiurge is the same as the demiurge of the Pymander, who is referred to as the second mind and son of the first mind. Father and son here do not actually indicate differences in being, but rather sequences of aspect. In the Hermetica, the demiurge, who is the god within the fire, produces the seven governors and sets them to revolve about the sphere over which he resides. This sphere is the intellectual world, and the seven governors, or administrators, are the archetypal powers behind the seven planets of the material realm. As lord and master of these intellectual gods, Helios, which in this case we would consider this the second mode of Helios, is the divine moderator. This is Helios Mithras, though Julian nowhere uses the name Mithras, but it is clear that this is what he is indicating. In the Mithraic mysteries, Mithras was known as the Cosmocrator, or world ruler, and Julian indicates that he is in the precise middle of all things. He is in the middle of all three spheres as well as in the very middle of the intellectual sphere itself, and in this way he acts as the channel for the outpouring of the divine energy which pours down from the intelligible realm, which he then imparts to the intellectual gods around him, and in this way they exist in a perfect harmony and order. each fulfilling its allotted part in the work of creation. Mithras was always understood in the Indo-Iranian religions as the divine mediator between heaven and earth, and Julian puts a special kind of emphasis on this by using the term mesotes, literally middleness, in place of the word mesites, mediator, indicating that these terms are to be understood as indicating one and the same thing, that true mediation comes from the midmost part. The third sun is the material orb of our own sky around which the other planetary and starry powers revolve, and imparts its vivifying light upon the world. For Julian and other late antique thinkers, the planets and stars in the sky were understood as gods, but not in the sense that the physical objects themselves are something worshipful, but that these were bodies generated for the specific purpose of letting through the divine light from the higher realms, and each was a portal for one of the intellectual powers. Thus, the arrangement and order of movement of the heavenly bodies of this physical realm is not arbitrary, but produced in purposeful reflection of the arrangement of the corresponding deities in the sphere beyond this one. However, in actual practice, though stated as different, the starry heavens above are often conflated quite generally with the powers of the intellectual sphere. These physical manifestations of the intellectual or supermundane gods are themselves what are variously called the mundane gods, or the visible gods. Sallust, in his On the Gods in the World, though in accord with Julian overall, nonetheless presents something closer to the traditional Neoplatonist view, arranges the gods into two classes, the supermundane and the mundane, and then further divides these into orders. The supermundane gods are divided into three orders: those who produce essences, those who produce intellects, and those who produce souls. The mundane gods he equates directly with the traditional Olympians, whereas Julian places them amongst the supermundane, and subdivides them into four groups. Zeus and Poseidon and Hephaestus are those who fabricate the world. Demeter, Hera, and Artemis animate it. Hermes, Aphrodite, and Apollo harmonize the world, and Hestia, Athena, and Ares guard it. Further, each is connected to a sphere of the natural world, which is either an element or a planet. Thus Hestia is connected with earth, Poseidon with water, Hera with air, and Hephaestus with fire, and Apollo and Artemis with the sun and the moon respectively, Demeter with Saturn, Pallas Athena with ether, Hermes with Mercury, Aphrodite with Venus, Ares with Mars, Zeus with Jupiter, and the heavens are common to them all. Julian's arrangement of the gods, on the other hand, is more detailed and more profound, giving them a greater role in the management of the world. Julian, being more inclined towards magic, spiritualism, and supernaturalism, also leaves room for the existence of angels, daemons, heroes, and various terrestrial or lesser gods who populate the sensible world. Returning to Helios, Julian says that by his middleness and uniform nature, he links the intelligible realm to the material realm via the intellectual realm, holding together things that would otherwise fall apart by use of the fifth element, the ether. It is he who imparts the intelligible forms, or ideas, into nature which produce the various material forms that we perceive in the world, granting individual existence to each and every thing. Light itself is a product of pure divine energy that streams from the pure mind. Vision grants us the ability to take in the light, which gives us discernment, allowing us to derive divine intellection through our reflection upon the world, and hence the human mind itself is illuminated. There are 5 things that we can discern about Helios. 1. He has the power to perfect all things through his light, for it is his light which makes them visible or discernible. 2. His demiurgic and generative power is discernible through the changes that occur throughout the whole universe, that is to say, that change is a reflex of the exertion of his powers. 3. He connects all things into a single whole by the harmony of his motions towards a single outcome. 4. That he is the center of all things is discernible by his midmost position. And 5. That he is king of the intellectual gods is likewise discernible from the sun's midmost position among the visible planets. His first providence in the material world is to establish a paradigm by means of his angels who combine idea and hypostasis, that is, intrinsic form and substantial nature, together. Second, his province is the generation of the realm of sense perception, aesthesis, whose more honorable part contains the cause of heaven and the stars, and whose lesser part presides over this, our world of becoming. For the earth contains being in a state of becoming. It is imperishable and kept in definite limits by Helios himself, for the nature of being cannot be unlimited because it is neither uncreated nor self-subsistent. Thus generation occurs when the light of the god stimulates the substance with his approach, but with his departure it diminishes and perishes. He actively vivifies it with movement and the flow of life, but his departure is the reverse, the cause of decay. King Helios proceeds from one, as the intelligible cosmos is one, and is one in himself. Now we consider Julian's conception of the traditional gods in his Heliacal scheme. Apollo was, of course, the traditional solar god of the Greeks and Romans, and so he was very often equated to Sol Invictus himself. So it comes as no surprise that Apollo, in Julian's account, is the deity closest in nature to King Helios. He might more properly be said to be more of a mode of Helios, which all of the gods are really portrayed as modes or attributes in some way, but this is especially true of Apollo, and Julian even says so. For Julian says that Apollo expresses the power of Helios to impart the ability to discern that all extremes and elements of the world are in their essence one. So essentially, Apollo leads us back towards knowledge of unity, that same unity that streams out from Helios. And Helios, in containing all the principles of the fairest intellectual synthesis, in himself becomes Apollo, the leader of the Muses. Apollo Helios begets Asclepius, who expresses the fair order of life that fills the sensible world, but was himself pre-existent to the formation of the world, being at the side of his father. For Julian, Asclepius was to be something of a pagan Jesus. The cult of Asclepius was very popular at this time, and Asclepius, through his miraculous healing abilities, was portrayed as the savior of mankind. Because he was associated with bringing people back from the dead, people who are very near death or who appeared to be dead but then suddenly recovered, Asclepius was elevated from merely being a god of healing to being a god of both spiritual and physical salvation, and Christians were rather threatened by this. So Julian seems to be trying to incorporate the popularity of Asclepius' cult partly for its own sake, but also as a way of countering the theology of Jesus as the salvific son of the Father who was given special prerogative over the created world. The little added bit that Asclepius was always existent before the world and coexisted with the Father really goes out of the way to hammer this point home. Dionysus is probably the next most important god in this scheme, as Dionysus was considered to share the throne of Apollo, which to Julian means that Dionysus and Apollo Helios are different aspects of the same god. Indeed, as Apollo's role is to draw our intellects and our souls upwards, Dionysus' role is that he is the power of division and separation. What this means is that it is through Dionysus that the one divine essence and the various forms that it carries are distributed throughout nature and given individuation. There is much more to say about the role of Dionysus in this theology, but I'll wait to cover that for when we discuss the deity Attis. So concerning how Helios relates to the other most important gods of this system, we are told first that Zeus and Helios share equal dominion over the region of absolute causes, which is both separate and prior to the created world. Zeus, of course, being the demiurgic aspect of Helios. Second, that Helios shares a singleness of directive with Apollo, which is bound up with imperishability and sameness. That is, that his directive is ceaseless and unaltering. Third, Helios shares the ability to divide essence into created nature with Dionysus. Fourth, as the leader of the Muses, he reveals the fairest symmetry in intellectual property. And lastly, that with Asclepius, he fulfills the fair order of the whole cosmos with life. All of these gods are considered to be the pre-existent powers of Helios. Helios rules over all 9 spheres of reality, including the 7 planetary spheres, the 8th or heavenly sphere, and the 9th sphere of the created world. He is the lord of the 5 zones of heaven, 3 of which belong to the Graces, and the other 2 to necessity. The goddess Necessity is specifically understood as the constellation Virgo, and the scales of necessity are the constellation Libra, which Virgo appears to hold. Thus, we can discern that the 2 zones of necessity refer to the darker, cooler parts of the year, as the autumnal equinox occurs in the period of the transition of Virgo to Libra, and it is specifically what constellations appear on the eastern horizon when the sun rises that mark each zone. The Graces were traditionally goddesses of springtime. Thus we can discern that the 3 zones of the Graces refer to the warmer, brighter months of the year. The twin gods Castor and Pollux, known as the Dioscuri, appear to represent the winter and summer solstices. Essentially, they are the polar aspects of Helios. Helios is further equated to the primordial god Oceanus, who is traditionally the god of the primeval ocean, but this idea no longer, if it ever, referred simply to water, but to the whole starry course of the heavens, and thus, by extension, of the seasons. This makes him the lord of the twofold essence. Julian reinforces this by quoting Homer that Oceanus is the father of all things. Further, the three spheres are divided into four segments by the life-bearing zodiac. From these are the 12 signs of the zodiac, and each of these 12 is further subdivided by 3 to produce the 36 decanal gods of Egyptian astrology. In this way, the threefold gift of the graces is imparted from above, from the three spheres, and divided into the 4 seasons through the power of Helios Dionysus. This whole array is handed over into the care of Athena Pronoia. Pronoia is more the emphasis here. It is a word that can be translated as forethought or providence. Thus, Athena, the traditional Greek goddess of wisdom, has become the embodiment of divine providence itself. Julian explains that Athena was born whole from the whole being of Zeus Helios, and not merely from the head or highest point of his being. For Julian, Athena Pronoia is essentially the female aspect, or half, of the god Helios. Athena shares the throne of Apollo, and is herself the intellectualizing principle of Helios, via the singleness of his thoughts. In this way, she is also the perfect understanding of Helios, made manifest that binds together in unity all the gods and powers which are assembled around him, and is herself the channel of the undefiled and pure life energy that permeates through the 7 spheres from the vault of heaven down to Selene, the moon. For the lunar sphere, which is that sphere that presides over the earth, is filled with wisdom by Athena, allowing Selene to behold the intelligible powers beyond heaven, and hence she adorns the realm of matter with the forms imparted from above, doing away with disorder and confusion. And to mankind, Athena imparts intelligence, wisdom, and the creative arts, and has through her wisdom produced in man the concept of the community or state. Finally, Julian covers the 3 planets Venus, Mercury, and Mars. Aphrodite is the synthesis of the heavenly gods, being the embodiment of the love and unity produced through their harmony, and in this way she assists Helios in the act of creation. This is reflected in nature, for when the planet Venus is near to the sun, it produces fair weather and generation on earth. Drawing from the cult of Sol Invictus's origins in the Syrian city of Emesa, Julian mentions that there the sun is accompanied by 2 assessors, Monimos and Azizos. These 2 Julian considers to be the planets Mercury and Mars, hence Monimos is Hermes and Azizos is Ares. It is possible that these 2 are perhaps also to be identified with the tenants of Mithras, Cautes and Katapates, one of whom bears an upward-facing torch, while the other bears a downward-facing torch, though Cautes and Katapates may also represent the solstices instead. We move on now to consider Julian's hymn to the Mother of the Gods. In his hymn to the Mother of the Gods, Julian takes the same essential components of Neoplatonic theology and applies them to the cult of the Great Mother. Essentially, the same scheme is laid out, but with the Mother of the Gods playing the role that was formerly assigned to Helios in the previous tract. This is not meant to be contradictory, but rather complementary. Julian understands the Great Mother to be the same goddess of providence, Pronoia, that he formerly equated with Athena, and this power, as we have seen, is merely to be understood as the female aspect of the one divine power whose male aspect Julian worships as Helios, and like Athena, she is known as the motherless maid. Indeed, Julian states that she is the spouse of Zeus, having come into being together with the great demiurge. She is even said to be the intelligible sphere itself, receiving into herself all the causes of the supramundane gods, and hence she is the source of the intellectual and demiurgic gods, who in their turn produce the visible gods. Julian's hymn to the Mother of the Gods goes into more detail the aspect of creation through the figure that was known in the previous Heliacal scheme as Dionysus, but here that same figure is called Attis, and if we consider the contemporary Greco-Egyptian religion of that time, the same character is represented by Serapis or Osiris, though he is vastly more totalizing in his presumed godhead than either Attis or Dionysus. Attis was the lover of Cybele, the Anatolian Great Mother, and the Greeks had long recognized him as essentially the same archetypal figure as their Dionysus. Attis was said to be the driver of Cybele's lion-drawn cart, and the Greeks told the same regarding Dionysus to Rhea. This Attis-Dionysus figure is the same as the figure called the Anthropos, translatable as the human or the man, that appears in the Hermetic text of Poimandres. The Anthropos is an aspect of God himself. He is the Son of God, but also one in essence with him, and bears the Father's image. Seeking to create, he peers down through the intellectual sphere into the sensible sphere, and his reflection is caught in matter, which is a mixture of the elements earth and water. His reflection passes the divine image into nature, who becomes a goddess herself, embraces the Anthropos, and with him produces the various life forms of the created realm. The same myth is told here by Julian, where the Anthropos is Attis. Attis's role is that which Julian had assigned to Dionysus earlier, that he is the aspect of the Godhead who imparts the divine ideas or forms into matter. However, Julian must now relate this concept through the mythology of the cult of Cybele. To summarize the myth, the Great Mother has for her mate Attis the generative power of creation. She seeks for him to turn only towards her and dwell with her in the intelligible sphere. However, Attis is drawn outside his sphere and descends to the lower nature, which is mythologized as Attis falling in love with a water nymph who dwells in a cave. The mother goddess in her wrath causes Attis to go mad and castrate himself, but in pity she resurrects him from the dead and seats him beside herself as a reigning god. For Julian and other educated pagans, these are all allegories. For instance, the goddess can in no way be jealous or ignorant or wrathful. The manner in which the story is told is merely for the understanding of the common people. Attis is in reality an aspect of Helios himself, who is the father of the divine forms, their immaterial cause, whereas Attis, who is equatable to nature itself, is that aspect which descends and imposes the forms into matter. Attis and Mithras are even imaged the same, as youths wearing Eastern clothing and a Phrygian cap. However, his powers of creation are limitless, but matter is limited. Thus, his power must be checked, or castrated, in order to maintain an exact harmony within the created sphere. According to the myth, Helios, who is here called the Great Korobos in reference to the male dancers of the Great Mother, is the one who checks Attis's progress by sending forth a lion entity. This lion is the cause of the fiery nature that separates the intelligible and intellectual realms. With the truth of his transgression revealed by the lion, Attis suffers madness and castrates himself. This refers to the idea that because the material realm is itself limited, it cannot hold to the perpetual generative power of the Anthropos Attis. Hence, if he were unchecked, then the forms within matter would become weakened and debilitated, so a set limit is given to Attis's course. Of course, this is all metaphor, as Julian assures us that this was all an organized part of the divine plan, and there was no confusion, overreaching, or madness or castration in any literal sense. Attis is really Helios himself, and thus, though he appears to be amongst the lowest order of the gods, he is actually the chief of all divine beings. He is presented as a demigod to represent that he is the power of change in comparison to the unchanging gods above. The Korobants, or sacred dancers who attend him, are the leaders of the three higher races, angels, daemons, and heroes, who are next in order to the gods themselves, and who assist in the work of maintaining the created world. He rules over the mother's lions, who are the fiery natures who transfer the energies from the intelligible to the intellectual spheres, the chief of whom is the lion who the myth depicts as checking his progress. I cannot help but to think that what Julian means by this chief lion is the lion-head god, or lion-headed serpent, whom appears throughout so much of late Roman religion at this time, and is sometimes a demiurgic figure himself. And indeed Julian's position of him as Lord of the Fire would indicate that he may be equivalent to the demiurge in Poimandres, who is likewise the god seated over the fire, and thus also a more positive version of the lion-headed serpent demiurge of Christian Gnosticism. In the cult of Mithras, the lion-headed god also seems to be related to the concepts of time and eternity, and it is speculated that he may have represented the gatekeeper who allows souls to pass from the temporal realm of creation to the eternal sphere above. Julian speaks of the heat from the fires of these lions as being the cause of motive energies and the source of preservation for all other things. Further, Attis is identifiable with nature or the sublunar sphere itself, as he is depicted as born near the river Gallus and crowned with a starry tiara. The river Gallus refers to the Milky Way, and the starry tiara to the starry sky itself. Specifically, the point where Attis's course is cut short is the point of the vernal equinox, when the sun touching the equinoctial cycle sets the universal bounds of our world. Julian says that the goddess herself selected the vernal equinox as her province, as this represents the time of the sun's greatest outpouring of generative energy into the earth. The autumnal equinox, which was traditionally the time of the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis, represents the same myth, but from the perspective of the need for mankind to purify themselves and protect themselves from the period of the coming darkness. Thus, the greater mysteries are held at the autumnal equinox, that we may remember our true selves and seek salvation, while the lesser mysteries of the spring bring us out of the period of darkness, that we may rejoice in the salvific nature of the gods. Turning now to the work of Sallust, his On the Gods and the World was designed as a blueprint for the education of a new organized pagan priesthood, and is a set of theological instructions based on Neoplatonic philosophy. The work mainly focuses on such things as the natures of essences, intellects, and souls, and how these are generated and cultivated in order to live a life of spiritual harmony with the divine order of the gods. There is also speculation regarding naturalistic phenomena based on the Neoplatonic understanding of the three worlds. Thus, the generated world possesses bodies that imitate the higher powers of intellect and soul. For example, planets imitate intellect in that they revolve in a circle, whereas the elements imitate souls in that they either ascend, fire and air, or descend, earth and water. There are also two orders of souls, rational and irrational. Rational souls are immortal and produced from the first order of the gods, whereas irrational souls are mortal and produced by the second order of gods. The rational soul is that higher part that possesses intellect. The irrational soul is a motive or instinctual force imbued into matter, but it has no true thought in itself and perishes with the body. Irrational souls only possess the attributes of sense and fantasy, or sensation and imagination, whereas rational souls have the attributes of intellect, cognition, and opinion. Rational souls use reason in their actions, whereas irrational souls do not and cannot. The irrational soul is the root of desire, fear, anger, and hunger. The rational soul knows nothing of these things. The rational soul is meant to rule over the irrational soul, and when it does, virtue is produced. But should the irrational win over the rational soul, then the result is vice. The rational soul possesses intrinsic knowledge of the gods, or as we might say today, it has the rational capacity to recognize the innate causes of nature, whereas the irrational soul only knows immediate bodily fulfillment. Soul is subordinate to intellect, and intellect is subordinate to essence. The intellect cannot be produced by a body. Rather, the gods have designed the body to be the instrument of the intellect. However, should the irrational soul overcome the rational component, then the body will have the mastery. The irrational soul produces in the body desire and anger, which are opposed to the gift of reason provided by the rational soul. However, reason can transform all these products into virtues. The virtue of reason is prudence, of anger, fortitude, of desire, temperance, and from the whole soul, justice. However, if reason is not cultivated in the soul, then each of these will contribute a vice. The vice of reason is folly, of anger, fear, of desire, intemperance, and of the whole soul, injustice. But we should know that there is no nature of evil. Evil is not produced by the gods, for their essence is wholly good. Evil is not produced by intellect, for then it would not be intellect, nor from souls, for that would mean that souls were a lower nature than the body. Nor is evil produced from the conjunction of the soul with the body, in incarnation, for two things that are not evil in themselves cannot come together to produce evil. Evil is the result of human actions. In the pursuit of pleasure, wealth, revenge, and the like, humans only perform actions that result in good for themselves, and not for the whole. In this way, they are only skirting around the good, but their actions create guilt. The gods have produced remedies for the expiation of guilt, such as sacrifices, offerings, prayers, laws, arts, sciences, virtues, initiations, governments, and judgments and punishments. And even when the soul departs from the body, there are expiatory gods and daemons, ready to purify the soul. However, guilt must first be acknowledged. The gods do not punish wrongdoing all at once, or else humans would only practice justice out of fear. Suffering for the guilty is sometimes the result of avenging daemons, and sometimes punishment which a soul inflicts on itself. Souls must seek rational expiation. For failing this, they will be claimed by avenging daemons in the afterlife. Likewise, the gods, contrary to myth, possess no anger for the guilty, for the nature of the gods is unitary goodness. Thus, they feel no anger, evil, or even joy, for joy would imply a sense of separation from the good that required rectification. Rather, when we feel goodness and joy, it uplifts our souls to the gods, but when we are evil, we make ourselves enemies of the gods, because we have made our natures contrary to their own. Anger separates us through dissimilitude, and guilt prevents us from receiving their illumination. Providence is exerted by the gods. Providence is proven by the manner in which the world is adorned, wherein all things develop towards some functional purpose. Thus nothing could have been constructed without reason or design, and providence has an effect on both souls and bodies. Whereas that beneficent exertion of the gods that results from and subsists in the body alone is called fate. Fate is that effect which the divine and heavenly bodies have upon physical bodies. This energy is innately good, but due to situation or aspect, those not cognizant of the mathematical movements of the heavenly bodies may misuse or misdirect these energies to bad results. This is no different than that the usual beneficent heat and light of the sun can become noxious to one who is bleary-eyed or feverish. What we call fortune is the accumulative result of an individual's fate. Fortune is purely sublunary, not existing in those spheres beyond the physical realm. Finally, we should know that the cosmos is incorruptible and unbegotten. Incorruptible, because if the cosmos should become worse, it implies an evil creator, but if better, it implies the defective creator, for why had he not created the world better in the first place? And the cosmos must be unbegotten, for otherwise it would beget corruption, because corruption is the result of successive generation. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed learning about the Emperor Julian and his pagan theology. If you're interested in learning more about Julian, I will have some books listed in the description below. And consider liking and subscribing for more content or supporting me through my Patreon. Thank you very much.